Chapter 4, Lecture, Family in the United States.
Let me begin today's lecture by saying that many people today are concerned about the decline in the number of people who are married in the United States. Here are some interesting statistics that explain why they are concerned. In 1960, 74% of whites were married, 72% of Hispanics were married, and 61% of blacks. Today, the figures are dramatically lower. Only 55% of whites are married, only 48% of Hispanics, and only 31% of blacks. When we look at the young, that is, people between 18 and 24, the figures are even more surprising. 45% of young people were married in 1960. Today, by comparison, only 9% of young people are married. Okay, what does all this mean for the family? Although many social scientists are concerned about the decrease in marriage and its possible negative effects on the family, others say it is wrong to assume that marriage in the United States is on the rocks. Rather, they argue there are changes in the culture which are contributing to different ideas about marriage and family. In any society, economic and cultural elements interact with each other and bring about change. That is what has been happening in the United States. I'll try to explain the way Americans look at family today by taking a look at how their views have changed over time. I'll depend on the writings of sociologist Barbara Defoe Whitehead in looking at 3 different time periods: the mid-1940s to the mid-1960s, the mid-60s to the mid-80s, and finally, the present. We'll refer to the first period as the era of the traditional family. The second period we'll call the period of individualism. And the third period we'll call the period of the new family. So, let's start with the first period, the mid-1940s to the mid-1960s, the era of the traditional family. This was the period after World War II, a period characterized by a very strong economy, a rising standard of living, and a growing middle class. The typical configuration of the family in these years was the traditional one: a married couple with children where the husband worked and the wife stayed home. Of course, some women worked, but divorce rates were low and birth rates were high. TV programs of the era depicted the family in this traditional configuration as working father, happy housewife and mother, and children. Culturally, 3 characteristics stand out in this period: conformity to social norms, greater male domination of the family than in later periods, and very clear gender roles, that is, clear and separate roles for men and women at home and at work. Well, things changed quite a bit after this period. The second period that I want to talk about today, the period of individualism, lasted from the mid-1960s to the mid-1980s. During this period of individualism, there were 3 important social and political movements. The first of these movements was the sexual revolution, in which sex was no longer always reserved for marriage. The second was the women's liberation movement. The women's liberation movement was an outgrowth of the struggle for civil rights. Women's liberation challenged discrimination against women at home, at work, and in society in general. The third movement, against the war in Vietnam, was more political than social. All three movements, the sexual revolution, women's liberation, and the anti-war movement, were typical of the non-conforming nature of these decades. Culturally, it is in this period where we see two important social developments. One development was a stronger focus on one's career and work. The second development was a drive for self-expression and self-fulfillment. These developments suggested that women could and should do more than raise children and take care of the family. In this period, the feminist movement challenged traditional gender roles and male domination of society. Women began to enter professions that had been generally closed to them, professions such as medicine, law, and management. Men began at least to consider a more active role in raising their children. In addition to the cultural changes during this period of individualism, there were also economic changes that affected families. The cost of living rose rapidly, and families saw the need for women to work outside the home to help support the family. Together, these cultural and economic forces changed the picture of the family. These new configurations included families in which the husband and wife both worked, families of single parents with children, and families of unmarried couples with or without children. With more women having careers and making money, there was less economic pressure for them to stay in an unsuitable marriage. Therefore, divorce rates doubled within a decade. Rising divorce rates and more financial independence for women made marriage less attractive for many women. Consequently, the number of single-parent households tripled. Less conformity to social norms led to an increase in the number of unmarried couples living together in this period. Can you see how economic and cultural elements interact with each other to change the family? Well, let's go on to the third period. The third period, from the mid-1980s until now, what we'll call the new family, is harder to see because we are living in this period now. However, I think that today, most people are happy about the social changes that occurred in the second period of individualism. Women are not willing to give up gender equality, the freedom to leave an unsuitable marriage, or the fulfillment of an interesting job. At the same time, many experts claim that children have paid a high price for the social changes that took place in the second period. Young children often spend long hours away from their parents and homes, in daycare, and school-aged children often pass after-school hours home alone while their parents work. Many children grow up with only one parent or with step-parents. A look at the new family shows that young people are more cautious about marriage than their parents were. They still very much want to get married and have children, but they are willing to wait for the right person. And they want to get educated and have good jobs before marrying. The statistics support these findings. The median age for a first marriage for men in the United States today is 28.7 and 26.5 for women, while it was 22.8 for men and 20.3 for women in 1960. Women may make more money than their husbands and share in the decision-making much more than women in the traditional family. And today, the ideal family has just 2 children. Parents, especially fathers, spend much more time with their children than in the past. And many upper and middle-class children have more structured activities like music lessons and sports than children used to. The changes in the family over the last 50 years or so have caused some politicians, religious leaders, social scientists, and everyday people a lot of concern. Should we be worried about the decline in the number of people who get married today, the number of women who work outside the home, etc.? All that statistics can show us is that our attitudes toward marriage and the family are different now than they were in 1960. I don't think there is strong evidence that marriage and family in the United States are on the rocks. Instead, our new attitudes toward marriage and family are one example of how American society has been changing.